Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn is an activist, a historian, a writer, and a playwright. He's the author of many books, including A People's History of the United States, The Zinn Reader, and an autobiography called You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. His three plays are Emma, Daughter of Venus, and Marx and Soho. He's a professor emeritus of history at Boston University. Howard, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
You describe in your autobiography a public lecture at which someone asked you from the audience, how did you come by the particular ideas you now have? And I want to follow that line of inquiry. How did the circumstances of your youth affect the way you came to see the world?
Well, I think that was, of course, a very good question. It should be asked of all historians.
Yes.
I guess growing up in a working-class family, going to work in a shipyard at the age of 18, working for 3 years in a shipyard, and getting into the sweat of an industrial life, and being aware of the difference between the way we lived our lives and the lives of those people we saw on the movie screen or in the magazines, developing a kind of class consciousness, and I think that had an effect later on my teaching and writing of history. Then joining the Air Force, becoming a bombardier in the Air Force, going through a war, coming out of the war with very, very strong anti-war ideas, even though I was in the best of wars, as they say, the good war. And then teaching at Spelman College, my first teaching job, teaching in a black women's college in the South, Atlanta, Georgia. 7 years there, going through, becoming involved in the civil rights movement. I think all of that shaped my thinking about history.
Let's talk a little about your youth first, and then talk about these other things. How specifically do you think your parents shaped your character?
Well, my parents were not political people at all. My parents were just ordinary. They were Jewish immigrants, worked in garment factories when they came here. Then my father became a waiter. You might say he moved up in the world from being a factory worker to being a waiter. And never even became a head waiter. So as far as political influence, no. The only influence they had on my life was my observation of their lives. My observation that my father was working very hard, an honest, hard-working man. My mother working very hard, raising 4 sons. And yet, of course, they had nothing to show for it. That is, they were perfect counterpoints to the Horatio Alger myth that if you work hard in this country, you will get somewhere. And I think that intensified my feeling about the injustice of an economic system in which there were people all over the country, like my parents, who worked very, very hard, had nothing to show for it.
One of the things that your parent did would obtain for you a subscription to a collection of Dickens books.
Right.
And so reading became very important to you and also offered you insights, right?
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, reading at an early age. And my parents knew I was a reader, even though they were not readers, and barely, my father was barely literate, my mother was somewhat literate, but they knew that I was interested in books and reading, and so they had no idea who Charles Dickens was, but they saw this ad, they could send away coupons and a dime for each book, and so they got me this whole set of Dickens, and I made my way through Dickens.
And what did you learn from Dickens?
Well, from Dickens, what I got was this ferocious acknowledgement of the modern industrial system and what it does to people and how poor people live and the way they are victimized and the way the courts function, the way justice works against the poor. Yes, it was Dickens' class consciousness that reinforced my own. It was the kind of justification for the beliefs I was already, developing. Yes, it sort of told me, I think what reading very often does for you. It tells you you are not alone in these secret thoughts you have. Not long ago I read in Kurt Vonnegut him saying that somebody asked him, "Why do you write?" And he said, "Well, the reason I write is to tell people you're not alone."
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I have this sense as I look through your career, and you mentioned some of these events in your life, your experience in the war at Spelman College, but I have this sense that life and learning for you are never separated, that life informs your scholarship, and your scholarship informs the way you live your life.
You know, I think that's true, a strong connection between the two, and it's probably because I had so many, I think, vivid life experiences before I entered the academic world, before I entered the world of scholarship. By the time I went to college under the GI Bill, at the age of 27, you know, I'd already, as I say, worked in a shipyard. I'd been in a war. I had worked at various jobs, and so I brought to my reading of history those experiences. And then I brought to what I learned from my experiences something broader, and that is a historical perspective which actually reinforced the ideas that I gained from my own life.
When you were, before you were in college, you were working on the docks, and you were involved in a demonstration at Times Square, and the police attacked, as I read in your autobiography. And you write, henceforth I was a radical, believing that something fundamental was wrong in this country, not just the existence of poverty amidst great wealth, not just the horrible treatment of black people, but something rotten at the root, requiring an uprooting of the old order, the introduction of a new kind of society, cooperative, peaceful, egalitarian. So that is an example of a kind of event that really changed your thinking, and that's an argument that you make in a lot of your history, that people can be changed by things that happen to them and act accordingly.
That's right. And sometimes it's one very vivid experience. And of course, it's never just one vivid experience, but it's that one experience coming on top of maybe a kind of only semi-conscious understanding that's been developed, and then it becomes crystallized by an event. And I think that's what happened to me at the age of 17 when I was hit by a policeman and knocked unconscious and woke up and said, my God, this was America, you know, where, yes, there are bad guys and there are good guys, but the government is neutral. And when I saw that, no, the police are not neutral, the government is not neutral, that was a very sort of radical insight.
Now moving through your life, you go on to school, working on the docks while you're getting your degree, and you do your dissertation on LaGuardia. What attracted you to LaGuardia? What did you find there that is really an important theme in all your work?
Well, what I found in LaGuardia, and remember, I wasn't studying LaGuardia as a mayor. I was studying LaGuardia as a congressman in the 1920s, representing a poor district in East Harlem. And as I read his papers, and I was very conscious that all through my education, from elementary school right up to graduate school, the 20s was presented as the age of prosperity. And here I was reading the letters that LaGuardia's constituents in East Harlem were writing to him, and they were writing saying, my husband is out of work, my kids are hungry, and they're turning off the gas. And LaGuardia was the voice of the poor in Congress. He was a lone voice in the Congress of the 20s, in the Jazz Age, speaking out for the poor, speaking out against Coolidge's sending Marines to Nicaragua in 1926, speaking out for immigrants. He was a radical in Congress, and that, of course, appealed to me.
You say that LaGuardia, you write, dug beneath the surface and held up to public view that which had been hidden.
Yes, and what had been hidden is the fact that underneath this veneer of prosperity, there were huge numbers of people in this country who were living under desperate circumstances. And to me that was important because it was not just a commentary on the 20s, but like all history, anything you learn about the past also becomes a commentary on your own time. And it suggested to me that in our own time, we must look beneath the statements of political leaders who say, we have an economic miracle today. The Dow Jones average has gone up, you know. And they suggest to me, no, we always have to look beneath these superficial signs of prosperity to see how people are living.
Your first teaching assignment is at Spelman College, a black college for women in Atlanta. Tell us about that experience and the amazing events that occurred during your stay. That is the large historical event.
Well, those 7 years at Spelman College, probably the most interesting, exciting, most educational years for me. I learned more from my students than my students learned from me. Living in the South at the very interesting time, the late 50s, early 60s, just before the onset of the big civil rights movement, and then during those years of the early 60s, I learned so much. For one thing, I began to look at history in a different way. I began to look at history from a black point of view, and it looks very different from a black point of view. The heroes are different, and the eras get different names. The progressive era is no longer the progressive era because it's the era in which more black people are lynched than in any other period in American history. I began reading black historians, reading Rayford Logan, reading Du Bois, reading John Hope Franklin, reading E. Franklin Frazier, and things that weren't on my reading list right up in graduate school at Columbia University. So that was one thing, learning about history. But the other thing, and more important, I think, was learning by being in the movement, by moving out from Atlanta to Albany, Georgia, demonstrations, Selma, Alabama, Mississippi, Hattiesburg, Greenwood, Greenville, Jackson, by becoming a kind of participant writer in the movement. It taught me something very important about democracy, about that democracy that I had been taught in junior high school, and which people even learn in higher education, institutions, constitution, checks and balances, voting, all those things that political scientists concentrate on. Obviously, that was not democracy. Those things had failed to produce equality for black people, had failed, in fact, to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. Every president of the United States for 100 years violated his oath of office by not enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. And what happened, that democracy came alive, finally, when black people took to the streets and demonstrated and sat in and got arrested by the tens of thousands and created a commotion that then was heard around the world. And so it was an insight suddenly. It shouldn't have been. I should have known that from before. But democracy comes alive not when government does anything, because government cannot be depended on to rectify serious injustices. It comes alive when people organize and do something about it. The Southern black movement taught me that.
You write in your autobiography, I began to realize no pitifully small picket line, no poorly attended meeting, no tossing out of an idea to an audience or even to an individual should be scorned as insignificant.
Well, yeah, I suppose, that's something that people learn when they participate in social movements, especially if they participate in the movement long enough to see it develop into something that at first seems impotent and impossible, and then becomes a force and brings about change. And I saw that in the civil rights movement, and I saw that in the anti-war movement. Because in both cases, you could see little things happen which seemed as if they would get nowhere. Seems as if you're up against forces that cannot be dislodged. I mean, here, the change takes place in the civil rights movement in the most dangerous parts of the country, in the Deep South, where everything is controlled by the white power structure, and blacks don't have the wherewithal. The only thing they have is their bodies, their determination, and their unity, their willingness to take risks. And yes, it starts with small things. You don't think they're going to get anywhere. Nobody really knew in the late 50s or even the first years of the 60s that anything big would happen, and yet it did. Anti-war movement starts off with small anti-war gestures and little gatherings around the country, and it seems impossible. How are you going to stop the greatest military power on earth from continuing a vicious war? And yet, those small meetings, demonstrations, turned gradually, over several years, into a movement which became powerful enough to cause the government to think twice about continuing the war.
You state your philosophy in one place, or one part of your philosophy of history, and you say, I'm convinced of the uncertainty of history, of the possibility of surprise, of the importance of human action in changing what looks unchangeable. And we can actually go to a concrete example in your life. You participated in one of the first, if not first, teach-ins on the Vietnam War in the Boston Commons, and you know, very early in the game. And then it was years later that you were drawing massive crowds to a similar event in the Commons.
That's right. In that very first anti-war meeting on the Boston Commons, it was in the spring of '65 when Johnson had begun the real escalation of the war, begun the bombing, begun the dispatch of large numbers of troops. And we had our first anti-war meeting on the Boston Common. Perhaps 100 people showed up. Mm-hmm. Herbert Marcuse spoke, I spoke, a few other people spoke. And it looked pitiful. Mm-hmm. This was in '65. In '69, another meeting on the Boston Common, 100,000 people are there. Mm-hmm. And in those few years, something very important had taken place. And I think that showed the possibility of change if you persist.
Your involvement in the anti-war movement was informed in part by your experience as a soldier. And I want to talk about one specific incident that you write about. It is one of the last bombing missions on the war, when you were a bombardier on a plane that essentially was one of the first uses of napalm on an innocent French village called Rouen. Tell us about that experience and what you learned from it, and how it affected your activism in the anti-war movement, but also your view of war in general.
Yeah, you have to understand that I've enlisted in the Air Force. I volunteered. I was an enthusiastic bombardier. For me, it was very simple. It was a war against fascism. They were the bad guys. We were the good guys. And one of the things I learned from that experience was that when you start off with them being the bad guys and you being the good guys, once you've made that one decision, you don't have to think anymore if you're in the military. From that point on, anything goes. From that point on, you're capable of anything, even atrocities, because you made a decision a long time ago that you're on the right side. You don't keep questioning. And you're not Yossarian who questions at a certain point.
From Catch-22.
That's right. Yeah, and so what happened with me, I was an enthusiastic bombardier, as I say. At the end, the war was over, presumably. A few weeks from the end, everybody knew the war was about to end in Europe. I was flying bombing. We had been flying bombing missions out of England over the continent. We didn't think we were flying missions anymore. No reason to fly. We were all through France into Germany. The Russians and Americans had met on the Elbe. You know, it was just a matter of a few weeks, and then we're awakened, you know, in the wee hours of the morning and told we're going on a mission. And the intelligence, the so-called intelligence people who brief us before we go into the plane, tell us we're going to bomb this tiny town on the Atlantic coast of France called Rouen, near Bordeaux. And we're doing it because there are several thousand German soldiers there. They're not doing anything. They're not bothering anyone. They're waiting for the war to end. They've just been bypassed, and we are going to bomb them. And what's interesting to me later thinking about it was, it didn't occur to me to stand up in the briefing room and say, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? The war is almost over. There's no need. It didn't occur to me. I mean, to this day, I understand how atrocities are committed. how the military mind works. You're taught to just mechanically go through the procedures that you have been taught, you see. And so we went over Rayon, and they told us in the briefing that we were going to drop a different kind of bomb this time. Instead of the usual demolition bombs, we're going to carry in our bomb bay 30 100-pound canisters of what they call jellied gasoline, which was napalm. It was the first use of napalm in the European war. And so we went over, we destroyed the German troops and also destroyed the French town of Rayon. Friendly fire. But that's what bombing does. I mean, to this day, when I hear the leaders of the country say, well, this is precision bombing, and we are being very careful, and we're only bombing military, you know, nonsense. No matter how sophisticated the bombing technology, there's no way you can avoid killing non-military people, you know, when you drop bombs. But in any case, it wasn't until after the war that I looked back on that. In fact, it wasn't until after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I looked back on that, because after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which at first I had welcomed, like everybody at that time did, oh yes, the war is going to be over, then I read John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, and for the first time, the human consequences of dropping the bomb was brought home to me in a way that I hadn't thought. You know, when you're dropping bombs from 30,000 feet, you don't hear screams. You don't see blood. And, but yeah, I suddenly saw what the bomb in Hiroshima did. I began to rethink, and the whole question of a good war came to the conclusion that there's no such thing as a good war. They may start off with good intentions, at least on the part of people who fight in them, generally not on the part of the people who make the decision. I doubt their good intentions. But there may be good intentions on the part of the GIs who believe, yes, we're doing this for a good cause. But those good intentions are quickly corrupted, and the good guys become the bad guys. And so I became convinced that war is not a solution fundamentally, for any serious problem. It may seem like a solution. It's like a quick fix drug. You get rid of this dictator or that dictator, as we did Hitler and Mussolini, but you don't solve fundamental problems. And in the meantime, you've killed tens of millions of people.
Let's talk a little about how you apply these insights from your own experience to the doing of history. And so let's talk a little about your philosophy of history. You've argued that the importance of what is selected and who selects the facts for history is very important. And in fact, you quote Orwell, who wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past." So I'm curious, what did these life experiences, your insight, how did that lead you to sort of focus on this alternative history, for example, of the United States?
Well, my growing up and going to work and becoming, as I say, class conscious, and then going to school and reading in my history books and looking for things that I had begun to learn on my own, because working in a shipyard and actually organizing young shipyard workers and getting interested in labor history and reading on my own the history of labor struggles in this country, and then looking in the history books that were given me in school, looking for the Lawrence textile strike of 1912, the Colorado coal strike of 1913, looking for Mother Jones, looking for Emma Goldman, Bill Haywood, they weren't there. And so it became clear to me that, yes, that the really critical way in which people are deceived by history is not that lies are told, but that things are omitted. If a lie is told, you can check up on it. If something is omitted, you have no way of knowing it's been omitted. And so it made me conscious of the fact that, and then looking through history and looking at other things, looking at race, looking at the treatment of women, it made me always ask the question, what has been left out of this story, and look for other things. So that when I started out my book, and I knew I had to start out with Columbus, because that's all histories of the United States start off with. I said, well, what is left out? The Indian point of view. You know, so then Las Casas comes into the picture, telling the other side of the story. The Jacksonian period, Jacksonian democracy. Arthur Schlesinger writes this glowing book about Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy. What else was going on? And then I find out that, you know, Jackson is responsible for the brutal treatment of the Indians in the Southeast, driving them across the Mississippi, thousands of them dying. Jackson is a racist. Jackson is a slave owner. Under Jackson, the industrial system begins with the mill girls going to work at the age of 12 and dying at the age of 25. So yes, I became conscious of omissions in history, and that's what I was determined to try to remedy.
As you write these accounts of the forgotten, and one reads your books, you really get inspiration by their courage, the courage that has not appeared in the text. But on the other hand, there is your courage, because, and I'm curious about the roots of that, the courage to take these stands, both as a historian in what you write, and as an activist. What are the roots of that courage in your life, do you think?
It's, to call that courage, to me, is an exaggeration. It's a sad commentary that we think it requires a lot of courage to just speak your mind. I'm not going to be executed. You know, I'm not even going to be given a long jail sentence. I may be thrown in jail for a day or two, and that has happened to me 8, 9 times, you see. I may be fired. I may get a salary decrease. I mean, these are pitiful things compared to what happens to people in the world. So it doesn't take much courage to do that. I mean, I had 2 friends, my closest friends in the Air Force, both of whom were killed in the last weeks of the war. And I think after you've been through a war experience, and after you've been aware of people dying, and somebody says, well, you know, are you willing to risk your job? Are you willing to risk a salary cut? Are you willing to risk that you won't get tenure? I mean, these are pitiful risks compared to the risks that people have taken in the world.
Many people, though, don't have that little bit of courage, so it makes a difference.
They need historical perspective.
Yeah, and personal perspective, you seem to be suggesting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'm curious, let's talk a little about writing, because one of the, I think, really important motifs here is finding the story, but then telling the story in a lucid, clear manner. Is it hard for you to write, or does it flow easily?
I don't have to struggle to write simply. That comes naturally to me. Maybe if I'd gone straight through college, graduate school, PhD, maybe I would have had the same thing happen to me that happens to people who go through the academic mill, and that it cripples their ability to write clearly.
I think that's a very good analysis, yeah.
And so I grew up reading Upton Sinclair and Jack London, and reading stuff that was clear and lucid, and or Dickens. You know, Dickens was not a florid writer. You know, he's a narrator, and so yes, I think that writing simply came naturally to me. I would have to struggle to write academic prose.
You're a person who is upfront about his values and upfront about the emotion that he feels about injustice. And I want you to talk about how your writing, do you think, is affected by the emotion, these honesties about both your values and your emotions. Is that a plus in making it easier to tell these stories?
Well, I know that there's the kind of conventional wisdom, as they put it, conventional foolishness, you know, that if you're passionate about something, you can't really write well about it. But of course, we've learned, in the arts, we accept passion. We accept that passion in the arts makes the arts come alive. But we don't accept it in scholarship. And therefore we draw a false line between the arts and scholarship. But I believe that being passionate about your scholarly work, being passionate about history, is something that needs to be expressed in order to be honest. I think nothing more important than being honest about your feelings. Otherwise, you are presenting something that's not yourself. And also, there's another element to it, and that is in being passionate about something, you are giving an intensity to what you write, which magnifies its power. And in a way, you're trying to make up for the fact that the people who have written other things dominate the ideological landscape. And because you're a minority voice, you have to speak louder, more eloquently, more vividly, more passionately.
You have written, talking now about history and the importance of education, and you've said, it confirmed what I learned from my Spelman years, that education becomes most rich and alive when it confronts the reality of moral conflict in the world.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Spelman College in connection with that, because there's an example of the interaction between education and activism. When my students went into town for the first time to sit in to demonstrate, to be arrested in the spring of 1960, I had colleagues at Spelman College, Morehouse, Atlanta University, the complex of black colleges, colleagues who sort of said, oh, this is bad, they're hurting their education. One of them wrote a letter to the Atlanta Constitution saying, I deplore what my students are doing. They're cutting class. They're missing out on their education. And I thought, what a pitiful, narrow, cramped view of education this is. To think that what these students are going to learn in books can compare to what they will learn about the world, about reality. And then they will come back from town, they will come back from prison, and then when they go into the library, they will go into it with an enthusiasm and a curiosity that didn't exist before.
You also wrote, I wanted students, here I think you're talking about your years at BU, to leave my classes not just better informed, but more prepared to relinquish the safety of silence, more prepared to speak up, to act against injustice wherever they saw it. What then is the link and the importance of history to activism?
Well, I think the learning of history is a way of declaring, I wasn't born yesterday. You can't deceive me. If I don't have any history, then whatever you, the person in authority, the president at the microphone, announcing we must bomb here, we must go there, the president has the field all to himself. I cannot counteract because I don't know any history. I can only believe him. I was born yesterday. And what history does is give you enough data so that you can question anything that is said from on high. And you can measure the claims that are being made by the people in authority against the reality. And you can look at similar claims that were made before and see what happened then. And here's a president who's saying, we're going to war for democracy. And then you go back through history and see, how many times have presidents said, we are going to war for democracy? And what have those wars really been about? So yes, the history, I think, can clarify things, prepare you for dealing with the duplicities of the real world.
I just happened to have reread your chapter on the Mexican Wars, and it's exactly what you're saying as you hear the issues, the themes, the concerns of that time, but which you often don't find in a normal history book. They resonate so much with the experiences of the Vietnam War.
Yes, and I remember the New York Times ran a poll once asking high school students questions about history, and the idea was to find out how much high school students know. They do this every once in a while, basically to prove that high school students are ignorant and that the people who make those polls are smart. And so the questions that the New York Times asked were questions like, who was the president during the Mexican War? That's a really important question. You see. But they wouldn't ask the question, here's the New York Times, presumably the ultimate in journalism, you know, this is not the Star, the National Enquirer, this is the New York Times. And they're asking who was president during the Mexican War, instead of asking, how did we get into the Mexican War? How did it start? What was at stake? What lies were told? How much discussion was there in Congress before there was a declaration of war? How much desertion was there in the American Army as a result of the American soldiers waking up and asking, what are we doing here in this bloody mess? So, yes, I mean, that's an example of where somebody at the start of the Vietnam War, listening to the claims of our government of how we must go into Vietnam for this or for that, knowing about the Mexican War, knowing about the Spanish-American War, knowing about the war in the Philippines, knowing about World War I, well, people who knew that history would not accept blandly what we were being told.
Is it fair to say of you, this is the sense I get from reading your work, that you retain a sweet optimism about human nature?
I don't know if I'd use the word sweet.
Okay, well, your smile is making me add that adjective.
I see.
Yeah, okay.
Sweet optimism.
Okay.
I prefer to think of it as a cold, rational optimism.
Okay,
yes.
As a historian, I would expect that of you.
Of
yes.
course.
Yeah.
Historians must not be sweet.
Yeah, okay.
But optimistic, well, yeah, a cautious optimism. Cautious in the sense that I'm not positive that things are going to go well. Can't say for... We don't, the future is indeterminate, but after all, the future depends on what we do now. And if we are pessimistic now, we are doomed in the future. That if we give up at this point, then we know nothing good is going to happen. If we act on the assumption that there's a chance that something good may happen, then we have a possibility. Not a certainty, but a possibility. So I believe it's useful, it's pragmatic to be optimistic. But not only that, not simply an act of faith, but also because there's historical evidence for the fact that when people act, persist, get together, organize, they can bring about changes. There haven't been enough changes, and so you can look at that and say, not enough. True, but the fact that some changes have been made, the fact that labor, by struggling, won the 8-hour day, the fact that blacks in the South did away with the signs of segregation, you know, the fact that women changed the consciousness of this country about sexual equality, even though those are only beginnings, you know, that historical experience suggests reason to think it is possible that other things may change.
So what then is the link between theory and action, do you think, that everyone should understand?
Well, I think that it's important people read and learn thinking that I'm not doing this just because it's fun or because it will enhance my professional career, that the purpose of learning, and this goes back to John Dewey, Alfred North Whitehead, and the purpose of learning is to have an effect on a world in which most of the people don't have the leisure, don't have the opportunity, don't have the breathing space, don't have the physical health even to read a book or learn. And so we who can do those things, you know, have an obligation to create a world in which maybe then people can do learning for fun.
You know, what advice would you give to students who might view this tape, read your text, the People's History of the United States? What lesson would you suggest that they might learn from your life that they might apply to theirs?
One thing is, because I claim there are many things they can learn
right.
from me.
But we have limited time.
So many things they can
Right.
learn from me.
Right.
One thing is that even if you're engaged in a movement where the future of that movement is uncertain, even if you're trying to achieve an objective which looks very, very far away, simply working for it makes life more interesting and more worthwhile. So that you don't have to look for some victory in the future, that the very engagement with other people in a common struggle for something that you all believe in, that is a victory in itself.
Thank you very much, Professor Zinn, for being with us today.
Thank you for those good questions.
Good. Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.